Hey, this is Kirk Corte, and in this week's edition of Forerunners, the Surfline podcast, I'm joined by lead forecaster Mike Watson to discuss one of the most memorable swells and storms in recent history to impact the East Coast and Caribbean, Hurricane Sandy. We'll discuss what it was like to forecast Sandy, the impacts of the northeastern U.S., our personal recollections of weather and surf, and what zones saw the best waves courtesy of the devastating storm. If you aren't already a premium member and would like to give us a try, which we would greatly appreciate, go to surfline.com/Forerunners podcast for a free 15-day trial of Surfline Premium. Here we go.
Okay, this is Sean Collins, Chief Forecaster of Surfline, and this is, the first order of business, looking down on the Southern Hemisphere, what to expect over the next 2 weeks.
At any given moment, a perfect wave is breaking somewhere on this earth. For the surfer, the trick has always been knowing where and when to find it.
All right, I'm joined with Mike Watson here down in Florida, and we're going to talk about probably the most significant weather event, really, that I've dealt with while at Surfline, and that's Hurricane Sandy, which was in October of 2012. Mike, what's your first thoughts when I say Hurricane Sandy?
My mind really, when I think about Hurricane Sandy, is just like, I don't really go to the surf first thing. I just kind of think of what happened up in New Jersey and New York and, some of the stuff that happened up that way. And then I do think of the surf because it was quite significant down here in Florida, from that with days of waves from this storm. But, the pictures in my mind are of what happened up that way. One of the reasons being is like a lot of people were doing, is I happened to be up in New England visiting family the following November after, Sandy damaged that area. And I went to Rockaway Beach with some supplies to, help out as much as we could. A lot of the forecast team kicked in on that, as a matter of fact. I drove those in. I spent the day in Rockaway Beach, just helping out however I could. Just kind of knowing, growing up in Florida and having to deal with hurricanes, just kind of knowing what they went through. But really, the image in my mind is two things. As I drove down Rockaway Beach, as an overturned car, I believe it was a Nissan Murano, new car, upside down and just demolished. And then one of the buildings there that had caught on fire and burned down. So, kind of the surf was, it was really secondary when I think about this storm. It's my thoughts go to that, and that's the image. And you say Hurricane Sandy, the picture of that car upside down, it's one of the first things I saw as I got onto, Rockaway Beach area. The plenty on the way in too. I mean, boats in the middle of the road up there, but that's what I think about, from this storm, where my thoughts go.
Yeah, it was, just thinking back to that, we have a couple cams in Western Long Island, and I remember when we eventually got those back up, and I was like, wow, like reshaped the whole coastline, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they've since rebuilt the boardwalk there and everything, but gosh, yeah, it's just, amazing the destruction or the destruction, power that the system had. It was just amazing.
Yeah.
And I guess we'll probably go into a little bit of the reasons why that was the case, and then also why it did send that really big surf down into Florida. You want to give us a little rundown of maybe the actual play-by-play on where Sandy developed and where it tracked and that whole deal?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do have in front of me, I do have the National Hurricane Center report to help jog my memory. But when we look back, the origin, of this storm was off the coast of Africa on the 11th of October. But it really wasn't until this system entered the Caribbean Sea early on the 18th of October that we started to see some formation or some potential of development in there. And about, I don't know, 4 or 5 days later is when we, started to see the system come together. So, pulling up, the historic track is on the 21st, that this became a tropical depression down in the Caribbean Sea. And, the initial track on this was to the southwest, before it, we kind of did a little loop in there and then tracked its way north. As it did that, it reached its peak intensity right around where it was hitting Cuba as a 100 knot. I believe it's a little bit stronger than that, but there might have been an intermediary wind. But what I have is historical hurricane track from the National Hurricane Center is 100 knots, which makes it a Category 3 hurricane as it hit Cuba.
Just to go in, basically, so what happens is that's stored in 6-hour blocks, right?
Yes.
So in between that, you could, it may fall in between those updates, but there may be a time when it was a little bit stronger than that. But sorry to interject if that's, people aren't familiar with how those things are stored, how those stats are stored.
Yes, and they're continually getting observations in between those time frames. So I'm trying to find if there is anything above that, but I'm not seeing it. So regardless, it was a major hurricane that hit Cuba and exited the coast there. What I can see right now is the max sustained winds were 100 knots shortly before making landfall from a Air Force aircraft. So that's the data we have from that. But as the storm pulled away, Sandy weakened a bit as it tracked through the Bahamas, down to barely holding on to a hurricane at 65 knots by October 26th. So that was at that point Sandy had weakened a bit from when it had made landfall over Cuba. So yeah, that's the history of it. And in that time frame, as it moved through the Bahamas is when it started to impart some surf into the Florida region down this way. So that's pretty much the early history of the storm in a nutshell in there.
It was really interesting. I feel like this is when the European model came into like the lay person's view.
Yes.
Is because prior to this, I think it was more, obviously we knew the scores that the various models get as we verify things, and we've known that the European model had outperformed the GFS model pretty consistently through time, and I think this was the time that it really smacked everybody in the face that the superiority of the European model at that time, especially with the eventual storm track of Sandy in particular. But you recall some of that I think we were chatting a little bit before this, and you were on the forecast for the whole East Coast.
Yes.
During the storm. And I don't know if you have any recollections of that, but I do remember there being the split, where a good amount of the guidance was saying it was going to eventually go out to sea. But the European model was holding pretty steady that it was going to hit pretty much where it did.
Yes, that was the introduction, I think, to the general public of the European model. Of course, we'd watched it and saw it and didn't discount that solution at all. And exactly it had a storm hooking left in the coast, which is, from a forecaster perspective, when you're looking at that and saying, hey, the model's not a model. No model is ground truth. It's just our guide. It's just a toolbook and a guide to give us an idea of what may happen. And it's really not that's kind of an odd scenario to see, especially in late October. Most of our storms, they recurve, and when they start recurving off to the northwest, they go that way. So it was very odd when you look and you see that sort of a forecast of a storm being forecast to track west back to the coast.
At that latitude, yeah, it's
right.
Definitely
especially at that latitude. So when you look at that, lack of a better term, your BS meter kind of goes up and says, well, why? What is it seeing? What's going on in here? Is there some merit to this solution in there? And yeah, it was not an easy forecast for anyone at that point. And it definitely brought the euro out. They latched onto this ahead of anyone else. And we saw that it did indeed happen and occur. And the storm did hit, the Northeast U.S. region with big impacts. So from that forecaster perspective, really, really tough. And, when you see something like that to go, yes, that's going to happen. I mean, I don't think anyone went at that point in time said, yeah, this is 100% slam dunk. But what it does do is to say, well, hey, this is being shown by a very reliable, credible model as one of the possibilities. So, you have to consider that and be prepared. Yeah, not really a fun forecast. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. And I know from thinking back to this, the idea once it was kind of a little bit better model consensus that the system was going to turn back to the left. The question then was when exactly does that occur? And, a lot of that's the strength of the blocking high that's over top of the system. And I think there was a winter storm that was coming that ended up dropping snow in some of the mountains. So there's a lot of different variables in play that would determine kind of where exactly that would occur. And obviously, if you're on the right side of the storm, the impacts were just catastrophic.
Yeah.
But if you were on the south, it wasn't necessarily, especially from a storm surge perspective, as severe as what some of the spots to the north of the actual track saw. So I remember that being a big thing that we were looking at, because here on the Outer Banks, we got wallowed pretty good, but not. We lost. I think Avalon lost the middle of the part of the pier, and there was a lot of damage on Highway 12 down to Hatteras Island, but fairly typical stuff, all things considered, for what we deal with relatively frequently here. But the one other thing that I wanted to touch on before we kind of maybe transition more into the swell perspective is how at this time the policy from the National Hurricane Center was, when a system lost its tropical characteristics, it was downgraded to an extratropical system. And that was deemed to have occurred right before it hit the Jersey coast. So
yes,
it was really interesting in trying to communicate that. And I know they've made changes actually because of Hurricane Sandy on how they communicate that and the advisories and the different things that they issue. But I remember that being kind of a big point too, was, well, technically it wasn't a hurricane when it hit.
Right. And it's funny that you bring that up, because I have in front of me right now are the changes made directly to that, this NOAA service change notice. And as you mentioned, directly from this, the National Tropical Cyclone Policy in place during 2012 required the discontinuation of any hurricane watches or warnings at the time Sandy became post-tropical. Discontinuing these warnings in the middle of the event was not viewed as an acceptable option by the NWS. So, after a careful assessment of recommendations from partners and users, including feedback provided to the NWS Hurricane Sandy Assessment Team, the NWS policy will officially modify its National Tropical Cyclone Policy for the 2013 hurricane season, and the following changes are effective on June 1st, 2013. Number one, and most important, is the definition of hurricane and tropical storm watches and warnings will be broadened to allow these watches and warnings to be issued or remain in effect after a tropical cyclone becomes post-tropical. So we can already see, a lot of impacts from this storm, but right there, this one storm changed the policy because the storm doesn't know that, I'm not tropical anymore. Well, it's still a dangerous system in there. So, it's great that you brought that up, and that is the exact service change notice that was put into effect post-Sandy.
And there's been a couple other changes since then, not necessarily because of Sandy, but now we have the potential tropical cyclone that's been introduced when a system is going to potentially strengthen into, a tropical cyclone, a depression, or a storm or whatever, before it makes impacts on a coastal area. And I believe that was maybe not directly tied into this, but the idea that you weren't able to issue watches and warnings and stuff. There's certain thresholds that had to be met before you could issue those. And if you didn't have a tropical depression, there's certain rules in place of what you could issue and what you couldn't. So there's been some changes, and I will never forget potential tropical cyclone 10 because I get reminded of that swell all the time. And it was when I injured my knee here. So I will never forget potential tropical cyclone 10. But anyway, so interesting, I guess synoptic history of Sandy.
Yeah.
But let's switch over to the surf end of things. And, we were talking a little bit beforehand, and a lot of spots, along the East Coast did not get good waves at all from Sandy. And, like we mentioned a little bit earlier, it even ruined some breaks up in the mid-Atlantic and northeastern U.S. One that comes to mind is Casino Pier.
Mm-hmm.
You had the pretty iconic roller coaster there on the pier. And I remember watching that cam and seeing some of those lefts come off the end of that pier, and it was just amazing. And I don't think I've seen that since.
No, and I've noticed that too since then is that seems to be a wholesale change like that, a lot of really great surf spot. And I remember just watching the camera, watching guys surf there, and it just seemed to fire. It was like a go-to spot, and it was always good and reliable. And I don't think it's been the same since.
Yeah. Pretty crazy. But one spot that we actually have seen go off recently, including the Super Bowl Sunday swell, was South Beach in Miami, which was, I think, one of the initial standouts during the swell from Hurricane Sandy, right?
Yes.
We got
absolutely
kind of chatting about the observations down there.
Absolutely. So, this harkens back. We broke this down in a feature on the site. You can see it there now. Anatomy of a Swell, Hurricane Sandy, October 2012, and I broke this down on just the whole event, on what happened, why were the waves so good at some of these spots that we saw. A couple of the key standout spots were South Beach, and then as the storm moved north, everything kind of shifted north with it. One of the things we look at, and one of the things that South Florida, the Bahamas weren't there, would probably have amazing waves a lot more than they do. So that island chain right there really blocks a lot of swell in there. And that swell window is so narrow in the South Beach that it's really difficult to get, epic surf down there. But when it does happen, we've seen the results. We saw the results January 2019. Saw the results January of this year, and then Super Bowl Sunday had some pretty fun waves as well. Not quite on par with the January swells, but pretty fun nonetheless. But that's what can make these storms very difficult in that area when you have a storm like Sandy that is tracking, on the east side of the Bahamas. And we're watching for the wind field to finally enter the window. It's kind of it's a very difficult, thing to really nail down when you're watching this in real time. When's that wind field going to clear? How far out is it? Those wind fields aren't static; they're changing all the time around the storm. And Sandy was again another unusual case where we saw the storm weakening as it left the Bahamas. In fact, as it tracked just north of the Bahamas and it's due east of around the Treasure Coast region, it's only a tropical storm with wind speeds of 60 knots at that point. And that's on the 27th, which I believe was the Saturday. So we'll back up, that Friday, the whole entire state of Florida was pretty much blown out. And there was one spot that wasn't, and that was South Beach. The winds there, the way the coast faces, if you really get down in the nitty gritty details of the Florida coast, is, we're not a straight north-south coast. And when you get around the bend from around Lake Worth south, the coast kind of takes a little bit more of a south-southwest tilt, just a little bit of a south-southwest tilt down there. So they're a little bit more receptive to a northwest wind than other areas. Like in my backyard here, up here in the Space Coast in the South Beaches region, a northwest wind can still be on shore here because of the way we face. So down there, more receptive, and they were the first ones to get it. And yeah, that Friday was really shaped up and turned out to be a really good swell there. And then that lasted into Saturday. They still had some really solid surf down there, but winds on Saturday actually started to become more favorable for other areas as well. So everything wasn't as compact into one zone, more to choose from. But the rare thing is we're going into day 2 of surf in South Florida, which, okay, like one day, you're used to seeing down there. Well, you can get one good day, but you start stretching into 2 and the swell's still pumping. That's kind of a rare bird, so to speak. Yeah. So, looking.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Kurt.
I wanted to touch on that finicky swell window for South Beach. You think about even this past year with Hurricane Dorian, and we were just kind of waiting for those strongest winds to make it far enough west so it would be able to get into the swell window, and it kind of never really did.
It didn't. It was 20 miles. That's what the miss was by. And I was on the forecast there, and I really was pretty confident that wind field was going to make it into the South Florida window. 20 miles was the difference.
And that's how crazy. That's just crazy to think about.
If that storm had just been 20 miles over, that's not a very far drive. So if that storm had jogged about it, and arguably could have even made maybe even about 15 miles, they would have seen a lot more surf than they did, which was pretty fun down there. But I was expecting some well overhead surf, and we didn't see the well overhead that I was expecting there from this. But we did, fun little swell, and it's just amazing. Yeah, the difference in what that can mean to the swell outlook down that way. It's just so narrow a gap. And one thing I learned from that storm is to communicate that error. When I'm writing these forecasts to communicate to the users is, well, we're looking at this storm, but that 20 miles is within a 24-hour error. So we need to consider that. These storms, it's very hard to nail down exactly where that center is going to end up, and that's well within the 24-hour error, track error. And that's really goes across when you look at the stats of NHC error, model error, and what have you. So, that's the one thing I learned is to point out is like, hey, we're expected to be here, but keep in mind the error is 20 miles. So that 20 miles in any direction could mean, the difference between pumping surf and no surf. And so it was a lesson to take away from that, definitely from Dorian during this past hurricane season.
So going back to Sandy, you mentioned that it was a tropical storm briefly, as it was east of the east coast of Florida. As it began to move away from the Bahamas, we saw it strengthen a little bit. But I feel like the main thing that happened was the just crazy expansion of the wind field with the system as it pulled further north. And I think that's one of the keys as to why the surf was so solid down in South Florida. Again, you were on the forecast. You want to talk a little bit about that and how that impacted maybe the spots even further north up into other parts of Florida.
Yeah, we did have a very expansive wind field. So we're looking at back on the 26th, and we can see how far the winds extend. And at this point in time, the winds on the northwest side of the storm, we saw 34 knot winds, tropical storm force or greater, 125 knots, 125 nautical miles to the northwest on the northwest side of the system. So yeah, as a storm was fairly robust, the wind field at that point, but as it did lift up, the wind field grew. So we're looking on the 26th to give you an idea. The wind field was on that northwest side of the storm, which is, that's where we're looking for winds in the South Florida swell window. Those extended 125 nautical miles. When we go to the 27th, now we see them that they're extending 250 nautical miles. So in 24 hours, we saw the wind field nearly double in size on that side of the storm. So you have a couple factors here. Is even though the storm has weakened as it pulls away, well, the wind field has expanded. So typically, if we see a weakening storm, say less surf. But what happened is the storm, it weakened, but the wind field expanded. So we saw a bigger, much wider fetch in evolve in 24 hours very quickly. That's a pretty quick expansion in there, for sure.
And it's good to note that swell generation, you need obviously wind speed and wind duration, but your fetch length and width is also a factor that plays into how much swell is developed. And as you said, as that expanded, that's one of those variables that lends itself to swell generation and swell growth.
Absolutely. All those waves are crashing together under there. And when they do that, in these wide fetches, we can maximize the wave growth with that particular wind in there. So, and that's what we saw. I mean, it was every bit of, from reliable, credible friends that I have down that way, we're calling it, 15 to 20 foot on the face at some of these Palm Beach spots in there. And, it was pretty big, when you come down to it, from that. But of course, what comes with that is a lot of current, in there. So we have, a lot of water moving from north to south. So really we're looking at more of the kind of the protected spots or some of the areas that can hold a swell like that in the South Florida region. Now, one interesting thing, I'd like to point out is a lot of people think East Coast and there's a lot of continental shelf. For the most part, that's true in a lot of areas, but when you head down to this area, that's not true. It gets deep very quickly off that coast of Palm Beach area, down into Miami, and you're entering deep water within, you can be in a couple thousand feet of water within just a few miles of the coast. So we don't get, the areas, the breaks down there don't suffer from that loss of energy to the shelf like other areas. And it comes in, fully powerful with full force into these areas. So when we look at an area, one of the standouts was Pump House, and you can see the video, on that anatomy of a swell that we did there, where Peter Mendia, one of the most well-known surfers in that, without question, one of the most well-known surfers in that area, but and a legend there, talking about that swell and showing some of the rides they got there, and you can see how it just really handles that in other areas as well. It's it's quite a bit different when they get swell there versus anywhere else in the state. That's for sure. It comes out of very deep water, maintains a lot of its energy and its power, and it's a place where guys are paddling out, with more than a step up, for sure. So,
and I think we also saw, the Caribbean actually got really big from this as well. I saw some footage of Tres Palmas in Puerto Rico. Some spots down there were definitely solid, but it seemed like that South Florida region was one of the standouts because of people like Pete that are able to take advantage of waves like that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And and the one thing from this, and like Pete mentions, is it's just so rare to have that many days of surf in a row in that stretch of coast. It's usually a day. Okay, if we get 2 days, wow, bonus. But this went on for like 4 days there. As Sandy, again, that growing wind field, as it grew over that course of that 24 hours, I didn't expand a whole much further than that. Still did grow a bit more. But that was when the greatest rate of expansion occurred. But, Sandy pulled away, and as Sandy did pull away, the storm increased in speed, fluctuated between 65, 70 knots, but then hit 80 to 85 knots, 85 knots, it looks like, on the 29th. And, those areas with a wide field is anywhere between off off the Outer Banks is going to send solid swell down to, the Caribbean and specifically Puerto Rico in there. So yeah, it's they were able to score some surf, and it's just kind of one of those ones where most of the surf was, Florida and south through the Caribbean, in that where, other areas didn't fare as well necessarily. A couple of other spots saw some big waves. I saw, you can see some solid surf that occurred in Delaware or in Maryland, some picks in there as well. Pretty heavy, but
yeah, Raven got pulled into a pretty solid one.
Yeah.
There, and it's a pretty crazy photo. It's included in that anatomy of the swell, as you mentioned, and so as we go forward, I guess the hope is that we don't have a repeat of any of this really as we get into the 2020 tropical season. The swell's great, but man, at what cost? You know what I mean?
Exactly. I don't think there's any surfer on this, in our sport that wants to see anything like that. We want everyone to just reap the fruits of the storm, the waves without any of this, because that's just it's kind of one thing I think about when I see this. I'm like, oh my God, it's going to be bad up there in New Jersey and New York, and so you're out surfing, but that's going to happen. When as well as I in this field, we know what's going to come with that. We know that that's going to happen, and here we are, we're out surfing and having a good time and trying to score waves. Yeah, because it's fun, it's great, and that's what we do. It's what we live for. We eat, live, and breathe this. But then at the same time, you have in your mind like, man, this isn't going to go well for some people, and it takes away from that, and it's on your mind, especially just forecasting it, like, oh my God, it's not going to be good up there, so it's something that you think about, you weigh it in your head, and it's there, and for me, in having I surfed this, I forecasted, it was important to go and try and help some too. As little as I did, it was just something, to get up there and spend a day up there and look at these people and go, hey man, we're in this with you. We know what it's like, for the storms to impact you like this. And, from that side, it's heady on a lot of different levels. So you're trying not to screw up surf forecasts. You're kind of worried about what's going to happen up, to the people that are in the path. And there's just so many moving things. It takes a little while to decompress from that and compartmentalize it all and what have you.
Sounds good, Mike. You got any final thoughts or?
Well, yeah, just a couple things. I think it's, if you really don't, just check out that anatomy of a swell. There's some real good stuff in there. We talk about the bathymetry off the coast. We go into some detail in there. What makes certain breaks work? Why does pump house get so good on some of these swells? Very important things that are just really important information to know what makes these spots work. We also have on the site an Ask a Forecaster on South Florida as well, that you can check out, and we really break down what's going on underneath the waters. Why does pump house? Why is this perfect left come out of there? And these guys are getting double overhead barrels and just perfect wave that shoulders out. So we go into some of that as well, and I hope everyone finds that interesting in there as well, and why these spots break the way they do during especially events like this. And as I can say is, I hope we're having an eye ahead to the hurricane season this year. We're in the middle of working on that outlook, and a lot of the forecasts have come out. I haven't seen one forecast calling for anything more than busier than average, and the signs are there pointing to that. So we're really just hoping. It's all we can do is just be prepared, have your plans in place, and just hope that somehow, some way, that this hurricane season turns out more like 1995 versus 2004, 2005, or 2012, or any of the last recent ones we've had in there. So,
sounds good, Mike. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to the latest episode of Forerunners, the Surfline podcast. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Just hit the red button below over the Surfline logo in the bottom right and let us know what you think in the comments below. We may even answer back in a future podcast. If you aren't already a member, just click on the icon on the bottom left for a free 15-day trial of Surfline Premium. Be safe, be good to each other, and we'll chat again next week.